The phone sat on the marble counter, vibrating like a trapped insect. Allison's voice cut through the kitchen, sharper than the knife I used for the kids' apples. "Your kids don't fit the aesthetic," my sister said. My daughter cried instantly, her crayon snapping against the table. My husband, Thomas, stopped mid-sip, his eyes hardening as he looked toward the hallway, where Brian's laughter echoed from the open doorway. Then, he calmly requested a full audit of their joint venture. Nobody saw the strike coming. The air in the room suddenly turned freezing. Noah huddled near the pantry, his tiny fingers gripped around a juice box. He was only 5 years old, yet he felt the weight of his aunt's rejection. Allison didn't look back. She was too busy adjusting her designer scarf in the hallway mirror. She viewed our life as a smudge on her curated gallery wall. To her, my children were just static in her perfect frequency. Thomas set his glass down with a heavy, deliberate thud. The sound echoed like a gavel. The quiet was worse than the insult. I reached for Lucy, pulling her shaking frame into my lap. She smelled like sunlight and strawberry shampoo, a sharp contrast to the bitter scent of Allison's expensive perfume. My sister finally turned around, her smile fixed and hollow. She talked about brand alignment and the high-caliber parents attending the gala. She didn't see us as family anymore. We were just obstacles to her social climb. I felt something fundamental crack deep inside my chest. The peacekeeper in me finally died right there on the tile. Thomas walked toward the counter, his movements fluid and predatory. He didn't raise his voice or offer a clever retort. He simply opened his laptop and pulled up the Monroe construction files. Brian's face shifted from triumph to a pale, sickly gray. He tried to laugh it off, calling Thomas dramatic in a strained, high-pitched tone. It didn't work. Thomas hit the enter key with a sharp click. That single sound signaled the end of Brian's decade of unearned corporate protection. Allison finally stopped talking about color palettes. She noticed the sweat beading on her husband's forehead. Brian reached for his phone, but his hands were shaking too hard to type. He knew what a full audit meant for a man who lived on borrowed credit and fake invoices. Thomas looked at me, his expression unreadable but steady. He was no longer the polite brother-in-law they had mocked for years. He was the CEO who held their entire lifestyle in his hands. The leverage had shifted. I stood up, holding Lucy's hand with a grip that promised safety. I told Allison she should leave before the paperwork became an official matter of public record. She tried to scoff, but the sound died in her throat. She looked at our mismatched socks and the messy crayon drawings on the fridge. For a second, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. She realized the aesthetic she worshipped couldn't save her from the truth. The bridge wasn't just burning. It was being dismantled. Brian stumbled toward the door, his bravado leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. He didn't look at Allison as he hurried toward the driveway. He was already thinking about his offshore accounts and the vendors he hadn't paid in months. My sister followed him, her heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm on the porch. She didn't offer a goodbye or a final barb. The silence they left behind was heavy and sweet. My kitchen felt like ours again. I breathed. Thomas closed his laptop and sat next to Lucy at the table. He picked up the broken crayon and started drawing a sun. He didn't mention the millions of dollars he was about to claw back from Brian's failing firm. He just looked at our daughter and told her she was the most important person in the room. The audit was already in motion, moving through the digital ether toward a dozen legal desks. Tomorrow, the world would see their fraud. Tonight, we were just a family. The digital clock on the stove hummed in the quiet wake of their departure. Thomas watched the driveway through the blinds, his thumb tracing the edge of his wedding ring. He didn't look like a man who had just declared war. He looked like a father who had finally seen a parasite under the glass. I began clearing the table. my hands still humming with a strange, electric energy. The apple slices had turned brown. I dumped them into the bin without a word. "We need to go to the park," Lucy whispered, tugging at the hem of my shirt. Her eyes were still puffy, but the immediate crisis had passed. I knelt down, smoothing her hair away from her face. I promised her we would find the biggest slide in the city. Thomas turned away from the window, his eyes softening as he looked at us. He closed his laptop and slid it into his leather bag. The movement was final. He was already thinking 3 steps ahead. We drove through the suburbs in a heavy, pressurized silence. The SUV felt like a fortress against the world Allison wanted to inhabit. Outside, the trees were turning a deep, bruised purple. I watched the houses pass by, each one looking like a stage set for someone else's drama. Thomas kept one hand on the wheel and the other on my knee. His grip was grounding. He wasn't just my husband today. He was a barrier. I felt the first sparks of real anger. The park was crowded with families who didn't know our names. We found a bench near the sandbox where the sun hit the wood. Noah ran toward the swings, his laughter sounding fragile in the open air. I sat next to Thomas, watching him pull a small notebook from his pocket. He began jotting down names and dates. These were the vendors Brian had mentioned at Christmas. The list grew longer with every stroke of the pen. He was building a roadmap of Brian's greed. "Brian used your name to secure the loan for the Riverside project," Thomas said quietly. He didn't look up from the page. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. That was a $5 million development. If Brian had forged the signature, this was no longer a family spat. It was a felony. Thomas leaned back, his eyes fixed on our son. He explained that Brian had been bragging about our backing for months. Everyone believed the lie. They thought we were the silent partners. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Allison's insults weren't just about social standing, they were a smokescreen. She needed to keep me small so I wouldn't ask questions about the money. If I was the low-caliber sister, I wouldn't notice the designer bags or the new wing on her house. She had traded my children's dignity for a stone fireplace. I looked at my hands and saw they were shaking. This was a deep, calculated betrayal. A group of women thereby started laughing, their voices echoing off the plastic slides. They looked like the parents Allison was so desperate to impress. I wondered if they knew their friendship was being bought with stolen reputation. Thomas closed his notebook with a sharp snap. He told me he was meeting his lead counsel on Monday morning. He wasn't just stopping the deal. He was going to expose the rot. My stomach churned. This would destroy our parents' vision of a perfect family. "They will blame us," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I thought of my mother's inevitable phone calls and the guilt she would weaponize. Thomas didn't blink. He said it was better to be the villain in their story than a victim in Brian's fraud. He was right, but the weight of it felt crushing. We were about to burn the only bridge I had known for 30 years. I looked at Lucy. She was smiling at a butterfly. She deserved a better world. We walked back to the car as the sun began to dip behind the mountains. The air turned crisp and sharp. Thomas checked his phone and saw a dozen missed calls from Brian. None of them were answered. As we buckled the kids into their seats, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from my mother. She wanted us to meet for dinner to smooth things over. She didn't know the audit was already alive. The first bomb had already been dropped. I stared at the phone screen as my mother's name blinked. The dinner invitation was a trap designed to force a reconciliation. My thumb hovered over the power button until the light died. We pulled into our driveway, the headlights catching the faded chalk drawings on the pavement. Thomas kept the engine running for a moment. He looked at the darkened house, as if calculating the cost of our safety. The air felt heavy with the secrets we now carried about Brian's illegal loans. The kitchen was cold when we finally stepped inside. I ignored the pile of laundry and focused on the children. They needed the rhythm of a normal evening to mask the coming storm. Thomas sat at the small desk in the corner, his face illuminated by a blue glow. He was pulling the public records for the Riverside project. Every click of his mouse sounded like a hammer hitting a nail. He found the first red flag within minutes. Brian had filed fraudulent permits. He used our home address as the business headquarters, Thomas said. His voice was a flat, dangerous monotone. I dropped a plastic plate, the sound echoing against the tile. My heart hammered against my ribs like a bird in a cage. If the project failed, the creditors would come for us first. Allison had literally bet our children's roof on her social climbing dreams. I felt a surge of cold fury that eclipsed the initial hurt. This was no longer just about an insult. I walked over and looked at the screen. The document showed a forged signature that vaguely resembled Thomas's handwriting. It was a clumsy attempt, but enough to pass a casual glance. Brian had been playing a high-stakes game with our lives. I touched the screen, my finger tracing the jagged lines of the fake name. We were the collateral for a lifestyle we didn't even want. Thomas grabbed his phone and called his lead attorney. He was done waiting for Monday morning. The lawyer picked up on the third ring. Thomas didn't offer a greeting or small talk. He simply stated that a forensic accountant needed to be on site by dawn. I watched his reflection in the dark window. He looked like a man who had moved past anger into a state of total execution. He gave the order to freeze the joint venture accounts. This would trigger an immediate liquidity crisis for Brian. The fallout would be visible to everyone by breakfast. While Thomas worked, I went upstairs to tuck Lucy in. She was already asleep, her breathing deep and even. I sat on the edge of her bed and listened to the hum of the house. Everything looked the same, but the foundation was gone. Allison had traded our shared history for a few years of elite parties. I realized then that she never actually loved us. We were just assets she could leverage. A single tear tracked down my cheek. I wiped it away quickly. My phone buzzed again in my pocket. It was a photo from Allison's Instagram story. She was posing at a pre-party cocktail hour with a group of women. The caption mentioned something about quality over quantity. She looked radiant and untouchable in her black silk dress. She had no idea that the money for that dress was currently being flagged as stolen. Her arrogance was a shield that was about to shatter. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of pity for her. I went back downstairs and found Thomas standing in the kitchen. He had a glass of water in his hand, but he wasn't drinking. He told me the bank had already flagged the account freeze. Brian had tried to make a large transfer 10 minutes ago. The system had blocked it instantly. This meant Brian was already panicking. He knew the audit was more than a bluff now. He was trapped in a corner of his own making. The end was starting. They will be here in the morning, Thomas warned. He put the glass in the sink with a sharp clink. I nodded, knowing the piece of our home was about to vanish. My mother's car pulled into the driveway, just as the porch light flickered. She hadn't waited for an answer to her text. She was here to fix the family. Armed with nothing but denial and tradition. I looked at Thomas and squared my shoulders. We weren't opening the door for her tonight. The headlights of my mother's sedan cut through the dark living room. She killed the engine but stayed seated behind the wheel. The glow of her phone illuminated her face. A mask of grim determination. Thomas stood by the door, his silhouette tall and unmoving. We watched her through the curtains, a silent audience to her staged arrival. She was the family diplomat, sent to negotiate a peace that didn't exist. My heart raced as she finally stepped out into the night. She didn't knock. Instead, she used her spare key to enter the mudroom. The chime of the security system felt like a warning siren. She walked into the kitchen with her chin held high and a forced smile. She carried a Tupperware container of lasagna, as if it were a white flag. "We need to talk about this misunderstanding," she said, her voice dripping with practiced warmth. She ignored the laptop open on the counter. She refused to see the war. Thomas didn't move to help her with her coat. He remained rooted to the spot, his arms crossed over his chest. I felt a surge of protective heat rising in my throat. This was the woman who had always taught me to be smaller. She wanted me to apologize for Allison's cruelty. I looked at the lasagna and felt a wave of nausea. It was the food of my childhood, meant to soothe me into submission. I pushed the container away. "It isn't a misunderstanding, Mom," I said. My voice was surprisingly steady. I told her about the audit and the forged signatures on the Riverside documents. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before resetting. She insisted that Brian was just aggressive in business. She called it ambition, not fraud. She looked at Thomas, pleading for him to be the bigger person. He didn't blink. He just stared at her until she looked away. The silence was heavy. Then she played her final card. She claimed that Allison was pregnant with her third child. The news hit me like a physical punch. This was the leverage she needed to make us feel like monsters. A high-risk pregnancy meant we couldn't stress them out with an audit. My mother watched me closely, waiting for the guilt to take root. She knew my soft spots better than anyone. I looked at Thomas, searching for a sign of hesitation. Thomas didn't waver. He asked her if a baby justified identity theft and corporate embezzlement. The question was a razor, cutting through the emotional fog she had created. My mother's face finally crumbled into a look of pure, unadulterated rage. She called us cold and calculated. She said we were destroying the family over a few harsh words. She didn't care about the truth of the theft. She only cared about the optics of the collapse. She was terrified. I realized then that she already knew about Brian's financial troubles. She had probably helped them cover smaller gaps in the past. Her frantic defense wasn't about the new baby. It was about her own complicity in their lies. She was a silent partner in the deception that had nearly cost us our home. I felt the last cord of my loyalty snap. I walked to the door and opened it wide. The cold night air rushed inside. "You need to leave," I told her. She looked at me as if I were a stranger. She gathered her purse and her pride, walking past me without another word. She didn't take the lasagna. It sat on the counter. A cold monument to a dead relationship. Thomas walked over and locked the door behind her. He didn't say "I told you so." He just put his hand on my shoulder. We stood there together in the quiet. The phone on the counter buzzed. It was a notification from the bank's security portal. Someone was trying to change the recovery email on the joint venture account. The IP address traced back to a local coffee shop near Allison's house. Brian was trying to wipe the digital trail before the forensic team arrived. He was desperate and clumsy. Thomas didn't even look surprised. He just picked up the phone to call the police. The night was far from over. Thomas stayed on the line with the police, his voice a low vibration in the kitchen. I watched the cursor on the laptop screen dance as Brian failed another login attempt. The desperation was palpable, even across the digital divide. I grabbed a trash bag and dumped the cold lasagna inside, container and all. The plastic thudded against the bottom of the bin. It felt like burying the last remains of my mother's influence. We were finally operating on our own terms. The clock read midnight. When the first squad car pulled into the street, they didn't use sirens, but the blue lights pulsed against the living room walls. Thomas met them at the door with a thick stack of printed evidence. He explained the identity theft and the unauthorized digital access. The officers took notes, their faces illuminated by the rhythmic flashing. They looked at the forged Riverside documents with professional curiosity. I felt a strange sense of relief. The law was finally involved. Suddenly, a screech of tires echoed from the driveway. Allison's SUV lurched to a halt behind the police cruiser. She scrambled out, her face a frantic mask of tears and smeared makeup. She didn't look like an elite socialite anymore. She looked like a woman whose world was burning. She ignored the officers and charged toward me. "How could you do this?" she shrieked, her voice cracking in the cold air. She was a hurricane of misplaced rage and sheer panic. Thomas stepped between us, his posture a solid wall of granite. He told her that Brian had crossed the line into criminal activity. Allison didn't listen. She kept screaming about her pregnancy and her children's future. One of the officers moved in, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. He warned her to calm down or face a citation for disturbing the peace. She finally collapsed onto the pavement, sobbing into her hands. The high-caliber aesthetic had finally vanished in the dirt. The officer asked if we wanted to file a formal restraining order tonight. Thomas looked at me, leaving the decision in my hands. I looked at my sister, broken and shivering on the ground. For a second, the old urge to comfort her flared up. Then I remembered Lucy's tears at the table, and the stolen home address. I told the officer we would proceed with every legal protection available. I wasn't her cushion anymore. I was a mother protecting her pack. Allison looked up, her eyes wide with shock. She couldn't believe I had finally stopped bending to her will. She begged me to talk to her, to remember our childhood. I told her that our childhood was over and she had killed it. The officers helped her back into her car and told her to go home. They stayed until her taillights disappeared around the corner. The silence that followed was heavy and cold. Thomas put his arm around me. "She won't come back tonight," he said. He looked exhausted, the adrenaline finally leaving his system. We walked back inside and locked the door for the second time. The house felt different, like a fortress after a siege. I went to the sink and scrubbed my hands until the skin was pink. I wanted to wash away the smell of Allison's perfume and the weight of her lies. Thomas began closing the open browser tabs on the laptop. He stopped on a final document he hadn't shown me yet. It was a secret life insurance policy Brian had taken out last month. He had named himself as the beneficiary of a policy in Thomas's name. My heart stopped. This wasn't just corporate fraud or simple identity theft. It was a plan built on a much darker foundation. Brian wasn't just waiting for Thomas to sign a contract. He was waiting for something far more permanent to happen. I leaned against the counter, the room spinning. Thomas pulled me into a tight embrace, his heart beating fast against mine. We realized then that the audit hadn't just saved our money. It had likely saved Thomas's life. The stakes had been higher than we ever imagined. I looked at the dark hallway leading to the kids' rooms. We were safe for now, but the police were already heading to Brian's house. A loud bang sounded from the front porch. The bang on the porch was sharp and metallic. I gripped the edge of the counter until my knuckles turned white. Thomas moved instinctively toward the hallway, shielding the path to the children. He reached for the heavy brass poker by the fireplace. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I realized the noise was just the heavy mailbox lid falling. A breeze had caught it. The relief was momentary and cold. We were both trembling from the weight of the life insurance discovery. Brian was much more dangerous than a simple thief. We sat in the kitchen as the clock ticked toward 3 in the morning. Thomas kept his eyes on the laptop, scrolling through the insurance documents. The policy was active and paid in full. It featured a double indemnity clause for accidental death. Brian had forged the medical exam records, using a corrupt clinic. My husband looked up, his face etched with a sudden, wary aging. He realized he had been working alongside a man who viewed him as a payout. The betrayal was absolute. It went far beyond money or social standing now. I checked the monitor and saw the children were still sleeping deeply. Their innocence felt like a shield I had to maintain at any cost. Thomas reached for his phone and called his head of security. He wanted a team at our house by dawn. He also needed a private investigator to track Brian's recent movements. We couldn't trust the local police to handle the full scope of this threat yet. The complexity of Brian's plan was still unfolding. Every click revealed a new layer of calculated malice. Brian was desperate to save his failing aesthetic. The sun began to rise, casting a pale, sickly light over the backyard. I made a pot of coffee, but the smell made me lightheaded. Thomas was already on a conference call with his board of directors. He was explaining the necessity of the immediate audit and the contract termination. He remained professional and detached, but his hand gripped his mug too tightly. He was protecting our livelihood and the company while I was protecting the home. We were two fronts in the same war. The neighborhood remained quiet and oblivious to the internal collapse. A black sedan pulled into the driveway at exactly 6 a.m. Two men in dark suits stepped out, looking efficient and alert. They were the private security team Thomas had summoned. One stayed by the front door, while the other began a sweep of the perimeter. The sight of them should have been comforting, but it only heightened the tension. Our private life was now a matter of professional surveillance. I looked at the coffee in my hand and saw it was shaking. We were no longer just a normal family in the suburbs. My phone buzzed on the counter, startling me. It was a call from my father, his first attempt to reach me. I hesitated before answering, my voice coming out thin and reedy. He didn't ask how the kids were, or if we were safe. He immediately began lecturing me about the damage Thomas was doing to Brian's reputation. He claimed that Brian was a good man who made a few small mistakes. I listened to his excuses and felt a cold wall rising in my mind. He was choosing a lie over his own daughter. I told my father about the life insurance policy and the forged signatures. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I expected shock or outrage, but he only cleared his throat nervously. He asked if we could keep that part quiet to avoid a scandal. He was worried about his own standing at the local country club. The realization was a sharp, bitter pill to swallow. My parents were complicit in the culture that had created Brian. They valued the appearance of success over our actual lives. Thomas took the phone from my hand and ended the call. He didn't say anything, but his eyes were full of a fierce, protective light. He knew the bridge to my parents was finally gone. He led me to the sofa and made me sit down. The security team finished their sweep and reported that the house was secure. However, they had found a GPS tracker attached to the underside of Thomas's car. It was a professional, grade device, recently installed. Someone had been watching his every move for weeks. Brian wasn't working alone. We realized then that the audit had to happen in person. Thomas decided to go to Brian's office immediately to seize the physical records. He wanted to catch them before they could shred the evidence of the second policy. I tried to talk him out of it, fearing for his safety. He reminded me that the security team would be with him at all times. He had to act before Brian fled the state. The stakes were too high to wait for a court order. He grabbed his coat and kissed my forehead. The house felt cavernous and empty after he left. I stayed in the kitchen with the remaining security guard, watching the children eat breakfast. Lucy asked why the nice men were standing in the yard. I told her we're helping Daddy with a big project at work. She seemed to accept the lie, but Noah remained quiet and observant. He could feel the vibration of the tension in the air. I kept my phone clutched in my hand, waiting for a signal. The morning felt like a slow, motion car crash. My sister's husband was more than a status seeker. He was a predator. I looked at the clock and realized the meeting was starting now. Thomas would be walking into Brian's office with a team of lawyers and guards. Brian would finally face the man he had tried to replace with a policy. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of fear for the fallout. If Brian lost everything, he had nothing left to lose. That made him the most dangerous man in the city. I heard a notification chime on the security system. The screen showed a car idling at the end of the street. It wasn't Brian's SUV or my mother's sedan. It was a nondescript white van that had been there for 20 minutes. The guard in the kitchen saw it too and tapped his earpiece. He signaled for me to move the children away from the windows. My blood turned to ice as I ushered them into the den. We huddled on the floor behind the heavy oak desk. The van door slid open with a dull, rhythmic thud. The guard drew his weapon and stood by the door, his eyes focused and calm. I held the children close, whispering that we were playing a quiet game. Lucy's eyes were wide. She didn't make a sound. We waited in the suffocating silence of the room. A soft scuffing sound came from the back porch, followed by a low whistle. It was the signal the team used when an intruder was spotted. My heart stopped as the guard shifted his weight. Someone was trying to get inside the house while Thomas was away. The scuffing on the porch grew louder, a rhythmic scraping of rubber against wood. My heart clawed at my ribs, desperate to escape the tight cage of my chest. I pressed my palms over the children's ears, praying they wouldn't hear the guard's heavy breathing. The oak desk felt like a flimsy shield against whatever was coming for us. The guard adjusted his stance, his silhouette sharp against the morning light filtering through the blinds. Every muscle in my body was coiled tight. I watched the door handle jiggle with a sickening, metallic click. Someone was testing the lock. The jiggling stopped as abruptly as it had begun, replaced by a heavy, muffled thud. A voice called out from the porch, low and urgent, calling my name. My blood ran cold because I recognized that desperate, high-pitched tone. It was Brian, but he sounded frayed, stripped of his usual corporate bravado. He wasn't trying to break in with a weapon, he was begging for an audience. The guard didn't lower his pistol, but he glanced at me for instruction. I shook my head violently. We weren't opening that door for a man who profited from our deaths. Brian began pounding on the glass, his silhouette distorted and frantic against the frosted panes. He screamed that the audit was a mistake, and that Thomas was overreacting to business norms. He claimed the life insurance policy was a joke, a morbid tax strategy gone wrong. I watched his shadow thrash, a drowning man trying to pull us into the depths with him. The guard moved closer to the glass, his voice a calm, low warning to retreat. Brian didn't listen. He was past the point of reason. He was fighting for his very survival now. The children began to whimper, the quiet game, finally failing under the weight of the outside violence. I pulled them closer, burying their faces in my sweater to muffle the screams. I felt a surge of protective hatred so hot it scorched my throat. This was the man my sister had chosen, the father of my niece. He was terrifying my children to save his own crooked neck. I looked at the guard and gave a sharp, decisive nod. I wanted the police called again. I wanted this nightmare ended before it reached my kids. Suddenly, the pounding stopped, replaced by the crunch of gravel and the roar of a second engine. I risked a glance through the slats of the blinds, my breath hitching. A black SUV had pinned Brian's van into the corner of the driveway. Thomas's head of security stepped out, looking like an angel of cold, hard justice. He didn't use a weapon, he simply placed a hand on Brian's shoulder. The physical shift in power was instantaneous and total. Brian collapsed to his knees, his forehead pressing against the cold bricks of our porch. He was finally defeated. The guard in the kitchen lowered his weapon and exhaled a long, shaky breath. He opened the door, allowing the crisp morning air to flood the house. I stayed on the floor with the kids, my legs feeling like lead. I heard the low murmur of men talking, followed by the distinctive metallic clink of handcuffs. Brian wasn't screaming anymore. He was sobbing, a pathetic sound that made my skin crawl with revulsion. The security lead walked inside, his expression grim but professional. He told me the house was secure and the threat was over. I stood up slowly, my knees popping from the tension of the last hour. I led the children into the kitchen, keeping their eyes fixed on the breakfast plates. I didn't want them to see the man being led away in restraints. Thomas called a moment later, his voice thick with a mix of relief and fury. He had successfully seized the physical files from Brian's office. They had found even more evidence of embezzlement hidden in a false bottom drawer. The insurance policy wasn't the only secret. Brian had been draining our parents' retirement accounts and the family trust for years. The realization was a final, heavy blow to the foundation of my life. My parents' retirement, the kids' college funds, all of it had been Brian's personal playground. He had used our shared future to fuel Allison's obsession with high-caliber aesthetics. I sat down at the table, the room spinning in slow, dizzying circles. Every birthday party and designer dress had been paid for with our own stolen security. My sister hadn't just insulted my children. She and her husband had been picking our pockets while they laughed at our low-class lifestyle. Thomas told me he was headed to the precinct to file formal charges of grand larceny and provide the evidence and documentation from the forensic seizure. He promised to be home within the hour to hold us close. I hung up the phone and looked at the cold lasagna still in the trash. It was a fitting symbol for the rot that had permeated our family. I realized then that forgiveness was a luxury we couldn't afford. We had to be the ones to break the cycle of silence and denial. No more smoothing things over for the sake of a quiet dinner. The truth was out. Allison arrived 10 minutes later, but the security team blocked her at the end of the driveway. I watched from the window as she argued with the guards, her hands flying. She looked small and frail against the wall of men Thomas had hired. She wasn't allowed on the property anymore. The restraining order was being enforced with clinical precision. She looked toward the house, her eyes searching for the sister who used to fix her problems. I didn't wave. I didn't cry. I simply pulled the curtain shut, ending the show for good. The children finished their breakfast, oblivious to the fact that their world had changed forever. I started the dishwasher, the mundane hum of the machine feeling like a victory. We were starting over, stripped of the toxic vines that had strangled our growth. The financial loss was staggering, but the emotional gain was worth every cent. We finally knew who stood for us and who stood against us. I felt a strange, quiet strength settling into my bones. I was the architect of this new reality. I was no longer just the sister. Thomas returned home just as the clock struck 10, his suit rumpled and his eyes wary. He walked straight to me and folded me into his arms, his heart beating a steady rhythm. We stood in the center of the kitchen, a quiet island in a stormy sea. He told me the bank was already working to recover the stolen funds. It would be a long, difficult process, but the legal trail was clear. Brian had been sloppy in his arrogance. He had left a map of his crimes for anyone to find. We spent the rest of the morning sitting on the porch, watching the kids play in the yard. The black SUV remained at the curb, a silent reminder of the protection we now required. I looked at the broken crayon drawings on the pavement and smiled. They were beautiful because they were real, untainted by the need for an elite aesthetic. We were messy and wounded, but we were finally whole. As the mail truck rumbled by, I saw a familiar gold-embossed envelope in the box. It was a late invitation to Madison's party. I burned it. The golden invite turned to gray ash in the fire pit. I watched the smoke drift toward the orange trees, feeling a strange lightness in my chest. Thomas sat beside me, his fingers interlaced with mine. The kids were inside, finally safe in a house that belonged only to us. The fraud was public now. Every news outlet in the city carried Brian's mugshot on their morning segment. His elite world had collapsed into a series of cold, metal bars. The truth felt heavy but clean. A week later, the first legal recovery check arrived in our mailbox. It was only a fraction of what Brian had stolen from the family trust. I stared at the numbers, realizing they represented years of our parents' hard work. Thomas told me we would reinvest every cent for the kids' education. We wouldn't let the money become a source of vanity or exclusion ever again. I felt the old lie about family peace finally dissolve. We were building a legacy based on integrity. My mother called one final time from a blocked number. She sounded older, her voice trembling with the weight of her ruined reputation. She begged me to help pay for Allison's new apartment, since the house was being seized. Didn't get angry or shout into the receiver. Simply told her that Allison needed to learn the value of $1. I hung up before she could mention the pregnancy again. I was done being the financial safety net for their lies. The recovery process revealed a hidden ledger in Brian's office. It contained a list of all the parents he had bribed for social access. I recognized names from the VIP list Allison had touted so proudly. They weren't high-caliber leaders at all. They were just people with prices and secrets of their own. I felt a surge of pity for the life Allison had tried to build. It was a hollow shell held together by greed. I burned that list too. Months passed until the yard was full of real laughter again. We hosted a small party for Noah's 6th birthday on the back lawn. There were no gold invitations or curated color palettes in sight. We had paper plates with dinosaurs and a cheap plastic pool. The neighbor kids splashed around, their shrieks of joy echoing off the brick walls. It was messy and loud and perfectly authentic. I looked at Thomas and saw him finally smiling without any tension. Suddenly, a familiar SUV pulled up at the curb. Allison stepped out, wearing a simple cotton dress instead of designer silk. She looked humbled, her hair pulled back in a messy knot. She carried a small gift wrapped in plain brown paper. The security guard looked at me, waiting for a signal to intervene. I hesitated, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at the kids and then back at my sister. I decided to give her one single chance. She can come in, I told the guard. Allison walked toward the porch with her head down. She didn't look like a socialite anymore. She looked like a woman who had finally hit the ground. She apologized for everything, her voice thick with genuine shame. She admitted the pregnancy was a lie she told to keep the money flowing. My heart hardened at the admission, but I didn't send her away. She needed to see what a real family looked like. We sat on the porch together, watching the sunset paint the sky purple. Allison asked if we could ever be close again. I told her that trust was earned with years of truth, not a single afternoon. She nodded, accepting the boundary without a fight. Thomas came over and handed her a burger on a paper plate. It was the simplest gesture of peace we could offer. As the stars came out, I realized the audit had fixed more than our finances.